if you're in position of power, you get to decide things, right? And your otherness becomes less salient to you, even though you have otherness, right? Meaning it's not as clear to you. So when my history has been, and over years, has been, whites don't think much about being white, for the most part, because it's invisible. Whiteness is like an invisibility, right? And people of color think about being people of color a lot, right? So they're having conversations, it's on the top of mind, it's in the context because of the power differentiation issues, right? When you're in the inside, you can't see what it means to be on the outside. It's really hard to identify, right? A lot of guilt and whatnot that goes on in that circle inside too, but for the most part, it's like almost invisible, right? And you have to really think about whiteness and what that means with regards to your heritage and all that. I mean, the fact that that came out in the context of it is a clear indication. So people follow me. So what is equity, right? So we got about an hour left, and one of the reasons we're here is to talk about equity, right? What is it? What does it mean? Why are we having this big battle about it? Part of the reason we have the battle is because of the power differentiation between those that are on the inside of the circle and those that are on the outside of the circle, right? Part of the reason is the history. So I'm going to go through a little history. You all have my paper that is unpublished, so you can't circulate that paper. It's about to be published. And so I'm going to go through some of that, of my own experiences, and then we're going to talk about some lessons, because even within this conversation about equity, there's some dynamics within it that make it difficult to move forward. And within the field, meaning there's a whole group of people that I'm working with nationally on this issue of equity, some of the big players in the field of equity, like Angela Glover Blackwell, Emmanuel Pasteur, and Ian Handy, and others that are doing this work all the time, and these are intellectual folk. There are some disagreement on how we should proceed, and I'll get to some of that. So I start this paper out really talking about my experience of being poor in North Minneapolis 50 years ago when the riots occurred. And my house that we lived in was right at the place where the riots occurred, meaning 50 years ago there were riots right on Plymouth and Knox, right where the riots that happened, or not riots, the protests that happened recently occurred, right? And I talk about being on welfare and policy that gets designed ostensibly to help black people that actually hurts them. And the policy was the national welfare policy. And so the policy of welfare created a dynamic so that in 1960, African Americans had the highest marriage rate in the country. 70% of black people were married. Black people actually all black people, no matter what your income, lived in the same community. So Tony Oliva lived down the block from me. The doctor lived down the block from me. The person that ran the bank lived down the, so all these people lived in the same context because they were segregated within community, in one community in North Minneapolis, and Jewish people lived there. So it was a mixed race community, so it was blacks and Jews living in the same neighborhood. Blacks actually came later. But there were covenants throughout the city of Minneapolis and throughout this metropolitan region where people could only live in certain places. When I say covenants on houses, that means you couldn't sell a house to a Jew or a black or an Italian in certain sections of Minneapolis. In fact, Hubert Humphrey did an analysis in 1946, and this is what took him on his quest. He did a survey in 1946, I'm pretty sure it was 46, might have been 45, when he was mayor, of what the housing conditions were. And this was the beginning of his kind of movement to civil rights. And that survey was a housing survey and basically exposed all this kind of underlying racism right? And was the precursor to the Civil Rights Office getting established in Minneapolis. And I read the surveys. I mean, it's pretty powerful. I mean, at that time, for him to do that survey, it was like courageous stuff, right? You know, you don't just do that. And so you had a segregation based on race that would occur based on housing. Now, how many people knew that? Everybody in the room, right? This segregation of African Americans in particular, when the riots occurred in North Minneapolis, most of the Jewish people moved out pretty immediately. At the same time that that was occurring, you had a change in the law. You had an implementation of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which really forbade discrimination in housing, and allowed the beginning of what I call Raisin in the Sun. How many of you know that play? It's a play called Raisin in the Sun. It really started talking about blacks having the aspiration to move to the suburbs, right? And so what happened in part was that a lot of black people that could, right? So there was a class of blacks that actually could move out of the black community into the inner ring suburbs primarily. So I remember when I was a kid, one of my uncles ended up moving to Ridgefield. That was like a big deal. So he moved from South Minneapolis to Ridgefield, and we were like, wow, he must be rich. You know, now you look back, he's got a little crack and jack kind of place. He's 97 now, he's still alive. But he's still living in the same house, right? And, now you look at it, he's like, really? So he really didn't move, but it was like a huge change. There was a brain drain, in part, from the black community that occurred because you had this separation. And then you had, at the same time, you had a change. So when my grandfather came here in 1946, he came here with his family to move out of the South, Mississippi and Oklahoma, right, because of Jim Crow. People know what Jim Crow is, right? These were laws that were put on the books after slavery was emancipated to keep black people in slavery pretty much. And to escape the Klan. I mean, there's just family stories about all this kind of terrorism, trauma that occurred for our family. And we moved, and this was the greatest mass exodus of people in the history of the world, actually. That black people moving from the South. Did you know that? Oh. That it was the greatest mass exodus of people in the world. There hasn't been another movement of people that big in the history of the planet. Black people moving from the South to the North starting in the 50s going up to 1971. Right? There was actually two migrations. One was in the early 1900s. But they moved to the north, and they moved because they wanted opportunity. People that move, immigrants that move from any place to any place, why are they moving? They're either political persecution, isn't that what we're talking about here? Or they're moving because they see opportunity, right? Or I knew somebody that got a job up here. That's what happened to my grandparents when they moved here. So they come up here for opportunity. And at that time, you could work in Minneapolis at three places actually. You could work out at Arlington, had an ammunition plant, right, that now they talked about for the football stadium. That plant was where black people could work. There was another place called Minneapolis Moline, which was a tool factory for machines. You could work there, or you could work at Munson Ware factory. Pillsbury later opened up its hiring, so then you could work at the plant on the Mississippi River. So these were the places you could work, and hey, there's a job there. My grandfather raised 6 kids, making $9,000 a year, with my grandmother supplementing work by working for rich white families. Right, so that's what she did. Right, and so they made an economic unit. They had a relationship, but after 1963, things shifted dramatically. Out of a compromise around the welfare policy, right, and a compromise brought by liberals, right? this is federal policy. The NAACP and the Urban League were involved with the compromise. They were deeply into it. And the compromise was that they had a program called Aid to Dependent Widows. Yeah, it was actually widows at the time. So white widows primarily would get benefits, right? And so they expanded the program to aid to dependent families, which created economic stream within communities of black community in particular, particularly in the North, right? And but one of the kickers was the conservatives said, we're not going to do this with able-bodied men living in the home. That policy ended up having huge ramifications. In fact, a guy named Daniel Moynihan had written about it at the time. It's called the Moynihan Report. And believe it or not, it was actually in part written by a black man named John Hope Franklin, and people don't really realize that he was actually involved with it as well. And Moynihan wrote that this policy is going to destroy the black family. And many of the folks that were lobbying for the policy, the NAACP and others, at the time said he was racist. And the language was different back then, but that's what they were saying, because he was basically creating a pathology, saying that blacks had a pathology, right? And then you see the beginning of a cultural argument, right? The cultural argument was that blacks have a pathology that's going to lead them to have a breakup of the family, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't just that policy. That policy is like a pointer, because this thing, what we're talking about, is very complex, right? It's not like there's a cause and effect, right? There's multiple causes. In fact, there was a guy named Gunnar Myrdal. In 1946, he wrote a book. He was commissioned by the Ford Foundation to write a paper on the black condition. The book was called The American Dilemma. It's a fantastic book. And it is a research analysis. He actually came from the Netherlands, Gunnar Myrdal. And he wrote this deep analysis on the situation for black people in America, and he called it the American Dilemma. And he came up with a term called cumulative causation. And what he said was, for African Americans, after he did this big analysis, African Americans in America don't suffer from one thing at a time. Actually, they have multiple causes. So a poor white might have one cause, and if you get them a job, they do better. And this analysis actually rang true to this day, meaning that people try to attack these problems using one kind of approach. It never works. It always fails. And then they blame the victim, or the people that are in the condition in the first place. So the reason I say this is because it's multiple causations, cumulative causations. When I was at Hennepin County Planning and Development, I got asked to do a study on homelessness, or on the welfare system, on AFDC. And that's when they were going to change it was during the Clinton administration, right after Clinton had come up with the new rules around welfare, changed welfare as we know it. We started seeing some patterns occur in the early 2000s that said that, wow, welfare is really changing and it's becoming all black. And in fact, when we did an analysis, most of the whites had left the system, right, because they had a time limit and it made it very difficult to get welfare. So when we started, before this change, the majority of people on welfare in Hennepin County were white.
And how long did that go to?
There was a 5-year window, and we were looking at it after the first 5 years. And we were trying to figure out what was going on. What we found is that the system had totally flipped. The majority of people on welfare, not just percentage-wise, meaning proportionally, but totally were black. Right? So there's still some white people in the system. And what we found was that white people's condition was episodic. Right? Meaning it was episodic. They had one thing happen, it's a situation, they'd get through the crisis, and then they'd get off welfare. African Americans would have multiple situations going on. So Gerda Murdahl wrote this in 1946 and it was happening in 2000. Right, the same thing, right? So the dynamics of policy having an impact on outcome was clear, right? But at the same time, you had this continuing debate going through the United States, compromise around the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is an Employment Act, compromise around 1968. Why did we need that legislation? Those were what wasn't included in the Reconstruction. So there was a change in the Constitution to free slaves. Did you guys know that? 14th Amendment. But the 14th Amendment didn't address issues of employment, didn't address issues of housing for African Americans. So this was kind of like, we're going to fix this through these acts. We're going to make things equal and create an equal playing field, right? But at the same time, all of this stuff is going on in African Americans. African Americans are moving out. You guys remember me saying that? Right? Other African Americans end up staying in those communities, and then you have policy, another policy. The federal, so during this time, through 1936, through the early 1970s, you had the development of a white middle class. Right? And why did the white middle class get developed, right? What happened? There wasn't really a white middle class prior to the New Deal. And the New Deal came out with legislation around housing, right? So you had the mortgage, now mortgages could be underwritten and you could pay over time on a mortgage and you could get government subsidies to do that. You had a GI Bill, so that folks were coming back from the war, right? And so you had benefits from the government to infuse. Who was left out of that?
Black people.
Black people. So there were actually rules written in to the legislation that if you were African American, you could not participate in the Federal Home Mortgage Act. Right, this is the number one thing. Now, whites now have, here in this city, or in this region, $144,000 in assets to $6,000 assets for African Americans. Right here. Assets, what do you think most of those assets are? It's a home. Right, so you created a system, right, that now we're actually seeing the outcomes of that system. Right? We would call that inequitable. Right? If you don't have assets, you really can't operate within our society in any meaningful way. Right? Because what do you use those assets to do? What do people use their home to do? Why? How do you use those assets? You use those assets to educate yourself. Right? You use those assets to get into business. Use those assets for all kinds of different things. So you set up an unequal system. That started back then. You had the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, St. Paul, let's just take Minneapolis, create a condition where they were, so if you were a black person, you came into the city, right? They even have a city map that you could see it. It was done in 1935 where they had the Negro slums. By the way, this plant that my grandfather worked at was right next to the Negro slums, right? So this was by design, right? By design, black people were put in, and then they had a thing called the Holman Decree that came up many years later that I actually was part of, which said you can't place black people just in one area of the city, right? But this wasn't just happening for blacks, they were like segregating everybody, and they put the Hmong and the black together because they didn't have any place else to put the Hmong, and et cetera. But this concentration of poverty that got created through public policy, right? And covenants on land, et cetera, steering of people, all of this stuff happened at once, created this huge separation by race and class within every urban city in America. Couple that with mortgage discrimination, credit discrimination, redlining. Do people know when I say redlining? Right? Within certain communities, right, you end up with huge, vastly different outcomes based on zip code, right? And there is no research, none, that says if you continue to put low-income people in the same area, so you can be in Appalachia, and what is happening in Appalachia? That's a group of white people that have isolated from opportunity. Right? So it doesn't just have to be by race. Anytime any group is isolated from opportunity, there's what they call deleterious effects, meaning poor outcomes. And this has been proven over and over again. So education is hampered. Right? Well, why is that? So, people say, well, we don't want black people to just sit next to white people, and that makes it happen. Something's magical about white sitting next to a white person or something. That's not what we're talking about here, right? What we're talking about is access to opportunity. How do I access opportunity? What is the structure of opportunity, and how does that structure occur? Right? If I live in a community where there is very little opportunity, social network, let's just take social networks. If I live in a community where I don't have any social networks, right, somebody's going to get me a job so-and-so. Everybody knows that most of the jobs, it's not by you going to the newspaper. I used to go into the newspaper and apply for jobs all the time. I never get any job. I'm like, what? I got qualified, right? But jobs are happening because people have connections. They have relationships. People hire people that look like them. I'm in the paper today in Minneapolis because I gave testimony at this equity commission in the legislature. And what do we find, right? So MEDA's done 20 years of data on minority businesses. And this data shows that every year for 20 years, right, minority businesses hire minorities at a higher rate than anybody else. So 50% of people working year after year in these firms are people of color, right? You're going to go to a white firm and find 50% of the people of color? 10? 15? 12? So this idea, so we've created a dynamic where some groups of people have access to those opportunities, other people don't. So let me go here. So what does equity mean? Right? So for the classic definition of equity that used in Seattle, and Seattle's kind of one of the most progressive places in the country to think about that, is that both the opportunity and the burden should be shared throughout the region equally. So you shouldn't have to share. So there's economic opportunity, like the light rail. Let's take, right? That's a $1 billion investment that people are making, right? That should actually be equitably distributed so that no part of the community is left out when we make these public investments, right? That's the whole idea of equity, is that we're going to actually. So when you look up equity in a dictionary, there's a lot of different definition, but underlying the definition is one of fairness, right? Fairness is like the underlying principle of equity, right? Meaning that you're going to be fair, that I'm going to be able to access and have opportunity at the same rate as everyone else, right? But not everybody's situated to opportunity in the same way. Right? So if I'm not situated to opportunity in the same way you do, and we both get 50 cents, right? My 50 cents is worth much less than your 50 cents because you actually have more opportunity to take that 50 cents and do something with it than I do, right? In my role, right? So some people say, well, we got to keep everything equal, right? But all of this history I've talked about, right, matters. Right? People want to say, well, no, there's no, hey, let's start equal starting line. And we're stuck in this country around this question, right? So let's think about it this way. A good friend of mine, John Powell, was at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Just Society, Inclusive Society. He frames it like this. if we're all in a mall, shopping mall, and let's say opportunity, whatever that is, we all, have an idea what that is on the 3rd floor of the mall, right? Some people, actually, there's different strategies we can get to the 3rd floor, right? We don't all use the same strategy to get to the 3rd floor, but we all want to get to the 3rd